The tunnel that traps lost souls. The road to nowhere. There are places in this world that should be forgotten. Places that whisper in the dark, calling out to those unfortunate enough to stumble upon them. This story is about one of those places. A tunnel, hidden deep in the woods of Pennsylvania. A tunnel with no official name. Some locals call it the road to nowhere. Others refer to it as the Black Mouth. But the ones who have been inside, they call it a doorway. Not to the other side, but to something worse. Something that never lets you leave. The day I first heard about the tunnel from my friend Nate, he was obsessed with urban legends, always looking for new places to explore. "You gotta come with me, man," he said one night, showing me a grainy photo on his phone. A dark, hollow tunnel entrance stood in the middle of the woods, its mouth wide and empty. "They say people go in, but they don't come out," he continued. "Or if they do, they aren't the same." I laughed it off. "Come on, Nate, that sounds like every ghost story ever." But then he showed me something else. A video. The screen was black at first, the only sound the crunch of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Then, a shaky flashlight beam revealed the entrance to the tunnel. A group of kids were laughing, daring each other to go inside. One boy, maybe 17, stepped forward. "You sure about this?" someone asked behind the camera. The boy smirked. "What's the worst that could happen?" He walked in. The flashlight followed him, illuminating damp, cracked walls covered in strange carvings. Then, the light flickered. The boy stopped moving. His breath came in sharp gasps, and then, in a trembling voice, he said, "Something's in here with me." The camera shook as the person holding it screamed. The video cut off. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. "What happened to him?" I asked. Nate shrugged. "No one knows. The video was found on his phone, but he was never seen again." The tunnel entrance. Nate convinced me to go with him that weekend. We drove out of town, following a dirt road that led into the woods. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. Even the birds stopped singing. Then, at the end of the path, we saw it. The tunnel. It was bigger than I expected. The entrance was a gaping hole, lined with old bricks that were cracked and covered in moss. The air around it felt wrong, heavy, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I hesitated. "You sure about this?" I asked. Nate grinned, pulling out his flashlight. "Too late to back out now." He stepped forward, his shoes crunching on loose gravel. I followed. The second we crossed the threshold, the light dimmed. The world behind us seemed distant, like the tunnel had swallowed the sound, the air, even time itself. And then the whispering began, the voices in the dark. At first, I thought it was the wind, soft murmurs echoing off the tunnel walls. But as we walked deeper, the whispers grew clearer. "Turn around. You shouldn't be here." I stopped. "Nate." But when I turned to him, my blood ran cold. He was standing perfectly still. His flashlight pointed ahead, at something moving. The figures in the shadows' shapes. Dark figures shifting just beyond the reach of our lights. Not people, not animals. Something else. They clung to the walls, the ceiling, the very air itself. Watching. Waiting. Then, one of them moved. It lunged toward us. Nate screamed, spinning around, grabbing my arm. "Run!" We bolted. The tunnel stretched. It felt like no matter how far we ran, the exit stayed the same distance away. Behind us, the whispers turned to screams. And then, Nate tripped. I turned back, reaching for him. But something grabbed him first. Black hands emerging from the floor, pulling him down. I lunged, and the world collapsed. The escape that wasn't. I woke up in the car. The tunnel was gone. The woods were silent. Nate was gone. I didn't know how I got back. I drove home in shock, trying to convince myself it was all a dream. But that night, I got a text from Nate's number. A single word, "Help." I stared at my screen, my hands shaking. I tried to call, but it went straight to voicemail. Then, a notification, a video message. I hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, I pressed play. The screen was dark at first. Then, a light flickered on. It was Nate's flashlight, inside the tunnel, and in the distance, barely visible, a hand, reaching out, scraping against the floor. Then, a face. His face, mouth open in a silent scream. The video cut off, and the last thing I heard, before my phone screen went black, was the sound of someone whispering, right behind me. The old radio that plays messages from the dead. The strange discovery. It started with a yard sale. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just browsing through old furniture, dusty books, and vintage knickknacks. Then I saw it. An old radio sitting on a rickety wooden table. It was large, made of dark wood with brass knobs, the kind of radio that must have been from the 1940s or 50s. The glass dial was cracked, and dust clung to the surface, but something about it called to me. "That's an antique," the seller said. An old man with sunken eyes and a voice like rusted metal. "Still works?" I asked. He hesitated. Then, in a low voice, he muttered, "It does, but it don't play what you think it does." I raised an eyebrow. "What does it play?" The man stared at me for a long moment before whispering, "Voices from the other side." I almost laughed. Clearly, he was just trying to make the thing sound more interesting. But something in his eyes told me he believed it. For some reason, I bought it, and that night, I made the biggest mistake of my life. The first transmission, I took the radio home and placed it on my kitchen table. It smelled of mildew and old wood. The knobs were stiff, and when I turned it on, nothing but static. I twisted the dial, searching for any sign of a station. The static warbled. Then a voice, faint, warped, like it was struggling to push through the interference. Then it cleared, and I heard a woman whisper, "Can you hear me?" I froze. The voice was distant but urgent. I turned the dial again. More static. Then, a man's voice, soft and ragged, "I'm still here, trapped." I yanked my hand away from the knob. My heart pounded. This wasn't normal radio chatter. The voices weren't coming from any station, and they sounded like they were speaking directly to me. The voices of the dead. I told myself it was a prank. Maybe someone had rigged the radio with a hidden speaker. I opened the back panel. No wires, no Bluetooth, just old, dust-covered tubes and circuits. The thing was too old to pick up modern signals. Then the radio crackled on its own. I didn't touch it, but the dial moved, the static faded, and I heard something that sent chills down my spine. My mother's voice. She'd been dead for 3 years, but there she was, whispering through the speaker. "I never left you, sweetheart." I stumbled back, my chair scraping against the floor. "No," I whispered. "This isn't real." The radio hissed. Then I heard my father. "We're waiting." His voice was hollow, like he was standing at the bottom of a deep, dark well. Then, a third voice. "Turn around." My blood turned to ice. I felt something behind me, but when I turned, nothing was there. Only shadows, stretching too far, reaching across the room like grasping hands. The man who warned me. I shut off the radio, unplugged it, tossed it into the garage. But that night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the voices. They knew me. They spoke to me. And worst of all, they weren't lying. At 3:12 a.m., my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. It said, "Do not turn it back on." My stomach twisted. Then, another text. "It opens doors." My hands trembled as I typed back. "Who is this?" No response. Just 3 dots like someone was typing. Then nothing. I didn't sleep that night. And in the morning, the radio was back on the kitchen table. I know I had locked the garage, but there it was, waiting. The dial was already turned to a new frequency. The thing on the other side, I should have destroyed it. But something made me sit down. My fingers reached out, twisting the knob. Static. Then, a deep, rattling breath. Not human, not even close. Then, a growl. Slow, low. "You let us in." The radio screamed, a high-pitched, ear-splitting shriek, and I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. But when I turned, nothing. Only the shadows, darker than before, stretching closer. I grabbed the radio and ran outside. The sun was rising, the sky painted in orange and pink. I dug a hole in the backyard and buried it. I told myself it was over. I told myself I was safe. The final message. For weeks, nothing happened. No voices, no whispers. I almost believed it was all in my head. Then one night, I woke up to a sound, a faint static from outside. I looked out the window. The ground in the backyard was moving, like something was digging its way out. Then my phone lit up, a new text from that same unknown number. It said, "You should have burned it." Then, a final message, 2 words, "Too late." I turned, and behind me, in the reflection of my bedroom mirror, I saw them, the voices. No longer trapped in the radio, no longer whispers in the dark. They were here, and they were watching. The voice that called my name in an empty house. A house that should have been silent. I never believed in ghosts. Not really. Sure, I enjoyed scary movies, ghost stories, and those creepy late-night YouTube videos about haunted places, but believing in them? No. That changed the night something called my name. When I was completely alone. It happened last summer. I had just moved into a new house. Nothing fancy, just a small, 2-bedroom rental in a quiet neighborhood. The previous owner had passed away, and the house sat vacant for nearly a year. The landlord gave me a good deal on the rent, which should have been my first red flag. The first few nights were uneventful, but on the 4th night, everything changed. The first whisper, it started around 2 a.m. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. A whisper. Soft. Almost too quiet to notice. It came from somewhere in the house, and it said my name, David. I sat up, my heart pounding. The house was dark. Still. Too still. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. Just silence. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was part of a dream. I laid back down, convincing myself that's all it was. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The footsteps in the hall. The next night, I stayed up late watching TV in the living room. At around 1:45 a.m., I decided to head to bed. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving down the hallway, coming from the kitchen. I froze, my body going cold. I lived alone, no pets, no roommates, but something was walking through my house. The floorboards creaked. The sound was so clear, so real, that I reached for the closest thing I could use as a weapon, an old metal flashlight. I stood up, forcing myself to move toward the hallway. The footsteps stopped. I turned on the light. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I checked the front door. Locked. Checked the kitchen. Nothing. But when I turned back toward my bedroom, I felt it, a presence, something watching me, but I couldn't see it. I slept with the lights on that night. The voice grows stronger. The whispers continued. Some nights they were faint, barely there. Other nights they were so close it felt like someone was standing right next to me, breathing against my ear. David? One night I heard laughter, low, amused. It came from the dark corner of my bedroom. I didn't look, I couldn't, because I knew if I turned my head, if I acknowledged it, I would see something I wasn't supposed to see, something I could never unsee. The shadow in the hallway. Then one night the whisper stopped. For a full week, there was nothing. I started to relax, telling myself it was just my imagination all along. Until the night I woke up and saw it. A shadow. Standing in the doorway of my bedroom, it was tall, thin, motionless, no features, just darkness in the shape of a person. I wanted to scream, wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. The room was filled with a suffocating pressure, like the air itself was being drained. Then in the silence, it spoke. Not a whisper this time. Not distant, but right next to my ear. David, I see you. The lights flickered, and the shadow moved. Fast. I slammed my eyes shut, forcing myself not to look, not to see where it had gone, because I knew it was closer. The truth about the house. The next morning, I packed a bag and drove to a hotel. I couldn't stay there anymore. I told my landlord something was wrong with the house. He hesitated before finally admitting I wasn't the first tenant to leave. A man had died there years ago, alone. And after his death, every tenant that moved in complained of the same thing. The voice, calling their name, the whispers, the footsteps, the shadow. None of them lasted more than a few months. I asked why he never told me. His response? Would you have moved in if I had? I left that house and never went back. But sometimes late at night when I'm alone in a new place in a new town, I still hear it. A whisper. Soft, close. David, I don't turn around, I don't answer, because I know it's still watching, waiting. And if I acknowledge it, it will never leave me alone.